If the CEO of a Fortune 500 company ran their accounting department the way the United States Congress runs the federal budget, they would not just be fired, they would be in federal prison. In the early 2000s, Enron collapsed because it hid billions of dollars of debt in off-balance sheet vehicles, complement partnerships designed to make the company look solvent when it was actually bankrupt. The executives went to jail. But the United States government is currently running an accounting scheme that makes Enron look like a lemonade stand. They are keeping two sets of books, the one they show you and the one that reflects reality. And the difference between the two is not billions, it is hundreds of trillions. Walk through Times Square in New York City and you will see the famous national debt clock. It is a terrifying digital billboard, ticks up relentlessly. As of early 2026, it shows a number hovering around 38 trillion. That is the official national debt. It is the total face value of the Treasury bonds held by foreign governments, pension funds, and investors. It is a staggering number, more than the GDP of the United States, China, and Japan combined. But here is the terrifying secret. That number is a decoy. It is a distraction. The $38 trillion is just the mortgage on the house. It doesn't include the credit card bills, the student loans, or the massive unfunded pension promises the government has made to 3 generations of Americans. To understand the lie, you have to understand the difference between cash accounting and accrual accounting. Every major corporation in the world is required by law to use accrual accounting. This means if a company promises to pay a worker a pension in 20 years, they must book that liability today. They have to show that they owe that money on their balance sheet right now. If they don't, it is considered securities fraud. The United States government, however, uses cash accounting. They only count an expense when the check actually leaves the Treasury. If the government promises to pay for your health care in 2035, that cost appears nowhere in the 2026 budget. It effectively doesn't exist. They're spending the residue of the future to pay for the present, without acknowledging the obligation. When economists strip away this accounting gimmick and calculate the fiscal gap, the true difference between what the government has promised to pay and what it will actually collect in taxes, the number is not 38 trillion. According to calculations by economists like Lawrence Kavanaugh and Daya from the St. Louis Fed, the true debt of the United States is closer to 200 trillion. This is the titanium iceberg. The $38 trillion is just the tip Jadian the war. The $162 trillion of unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and government pensions, is the jagged mass beneath the surface that is about to tear the whole of the U.S. economy apart. The mechanism of this deception relies on a specific myth that politicians from both parties have guarded for decades, the myth of the trust fund. Most Americans believe that Social Security is a savings account. They believe that the payroll taxes they have paid for 40 years are sitting in a lockbox in Washington earning interest, waiting for them to retire. This is a lie. There is no lockbox. There is no money. The Social Security Trust Fund contains $0. It contains non-marketable special issue securities. These are effectively IOUs. Here's how the scan works. When you pay a payroll tax, the government takes that cash and immediately spends it. It spends it on the military, on interest payments, on welfare, and on roads. In exchange, the Treasury writes a piece of paper that says, "We owe Social Security this much money," and puts it in a filing cabinet in West Virginia. That piece of paper is not an asset. It is a claim on future tax revenue. When you retire, the government cannot sell that piece of paper to China or Japan to pay benefits. It has to tax your children to pay you. The trust fund is simply an accounting entry that records how much the government has borrowed from the working class to fund the general budget. For decades, this Ponzi scheme worked because of demographics. In 1950, there were 16 workers paying taxes for every one retiree collecting benefits. It was easy to pay the current retirees with the surplus cash from the massive workforce. Today, that ratio is approaching 2 to 1. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every single day. They are switching from being net taxpayers, putting money in, to net tax eaters, taking money out. They're moving from the asset column to the liability column. And because the government spent all their money decades ago, there is nothing left in the vault to pay them. This is why the fiscal gap is exploding. The bill for 70 years of promises is right. In the wallet is empty. The scale of $200 trillion is almost impossible for the human brain to comprehend. If you taxed every single American corporation 100% of their profits, if you took every dime Apple, Google, and Exxon made, it wouldn't even cover the interest on the true debt. If you confiscated the total wealth of every billionaire in America, it would fund the government for a few months. We have promised more wealth than exists on the planet. This is not a political problem that can be solved by taxing the rich or cutting waste. It is a mathematical impossibility. We are looking at a default. The only question is whether it will be an honest default where the government admits it can't pay, or a dishonest default where they print the money and destroy its value. Most people think this crisis is years away. They think it's a problem for their grandchildren. But the math says the wall is right in front of us. The interest payments on the official debt alone have already surpassed the defense budget. We are borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money we borrowed to pay the interest. This is the definition of a debt spiral. In the next section, we will look at the silent default. We will explain why the government will never admit they're bankrupt. Instead, they will use a tool called financial repletion to steal the value of your savings without you ever realizing it. We will examine the history of how nations like post-war Britain used inflation to liquidate their debt and why the 2020s in America are starting to look exactly like the 1940s. When a government owes more money than it can ever hope to repay, it faces a binary choice. Option A is an honest default. The president walks to the podium, walks into the camera, and says, "We are broke. We are cutting Social Security by 50%, and we are only paying 7 cents on the dollar for every Treasury bond." This option is honest, brutal, and politically suicidal. It causes immediate riots, bank failures, and the collapse of the ruling party. Therefore, in the history of modern democracies, option A is almost never chosen. To manage this transition without facing a revolution, the state needs a neat set of tools. The old tools of cash and bonds are too free. Cash is anonymous. It allows people to exit the banking system. Bonds are voluntary. People can sell them. To solve the $200 trillion problem, the government must close the exits. We are witnessing the construction of the digital Berlin Wall. The cornerstone of this wall is the central bank digital currency, CBDC. Policymakers sell CBDCs as an upgrade to the financial system, a way to make payments faster and help the unbanked. This is the marketing pitch. The engineering reality is that a CBDC is a tool of total control. In the current system, if the Fed wants to stimulate the economy, they lower interest rates, hoping banks will lend. It is like pushing on a string. With a CBDC, the Fed can bypass the banks entirely. They can deposit stimulus tokens directly into your digital wallet. But critically, they can also apply negative interest rates directly to your savings. If inflation is raging and they want you to stop hoarding money, they can program your digital dollars to expire if not spent within 30 days. They can impose a 5% monthly holding fee. This forces the velocity of money to accelerate. You must spend or your wealth vanishes. It solves the debt problem by effectively outlawing savings. Furthermore, a CBDC allows for granular taxation and social engineering. Currently, the IRS relies on you to report your income. Under a CBDC system, the government sees every transaction in real time. They can deduct taxes automatically at the point of sale. They can also enforce capital controls with an algorithm. If you try to convert your digital dollars into gold, Bitcoin, or Swiss francs to escape the inflation, the transaction can be simply declined. Error 403, unauthorized asset class. This is not science fiction. It is the stated goal of economists advocating for the abolition of physical cash. They argue that cash is the brake on monetary policy because it allows citizens to opt out negative rates. To save the system, the brake must be removed. This leads us to the terrifying concept of the bail-in. Most Americans assume if their bank fails, the government will bail it out using taxpayer money. But after the 2008 crisis, the rules changed globally. The Dodd-Frank Act in the U.S. and similar laws in Europe established the bail-in protocol. This declares that in the event of a systemic failure, the bank's creditors must take a loss to save the institution. Here is the reality at future prices of the state. You are cried to bank. When you deposit $10,000, you are legally lending that money to the bank. The money is no longer yours. It is theirs. You hold an IOU. In a bail-in scenario, the regulators can legally convert your cash deposits, the bank liability, into bank equity stock. You go to sleep with $100,000 in your checking account. You wake up with $50,000 in cash. It the 2000s were the shares in enquanto eng, it train at zero. It happened in Cyprus in 2013. It is the blueprint for the next sovereignty crisis. The $200 trillion gap will be filled, not just by printing money, but by confiscating the unsecured liabilities of the banking system, your savings. It 3 proves that when a sovereign state faces insolvency, property rights are suspended. The most chilling salvo occurred not in a distant dictatorship, in the United States under wise most sober depressings. In 1933, the U.S. government was cornered. It had promised to redeem paper dollars for gold, printed $20 and ding on of gold. The other solution would have been to devalue the dollar or start the redemption. When Roosevelt chose the predatory solution, she Executive 6102. He claimed that hoarding gold was prolonging the depression. He made a federal crime punishable by 10 years in prison for any American citizen to own more than $100 worth of gold coins or bullion. He ordered every citizen to turn their gold into the Federal Reserve. The government paid him the official rate, $267 per ounce. Americans, trusting their government or fearing the jail time, lined up to hand over their generational wealth. Once the gold was secured in the government vaults, Roosevelt devouring the dollar, he raised the official price of gold to $35 per ounce. Overnight, he had stolen roughly 40% of the wealth of the American people. He took their hard assets, gave them paper, and then torpedoed the value of the paper. The Supreme Court later upheld this confiscation, ruling that the government's power to regulate currency supersedes the individual's right to property. This event destroys the idea that it can't happen here. It did happen here. In the legal framework that allowed the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 is still on the books. It was the statutory basis for freezing Russian assets in 2022. It can be used to freeze domestic assets in a national emergency. The only difference today is that they don't need to send agents to search your house for gold coins. Because your wealth is digital, they can seize it with a keystroke. They can freeze your brokerage account, seize your 401k, and convert it into government retirement bonds, a proposal that surfaces periodically in Washington, or lock your bank account. The Great Reset is essentially a modern jubilee, but one where the pain is transferred from the borrower to the saver. The $200 trillion debt cannot be paid. It must be liquidated. It will be liquidated through a combination of high inflation, which eats your purchasing power, financial repression, which prevents you from earning a return, and potentially direct confiscation, bail-ins, or wealth taxes. The government has a plan to survive this collapse. They will have the printing press, the CBDC, in the police power of the state. The question is, do you have a plan? The average citizen is sitting in a theater that is on fire watching the movie, oblivious to the smoke. They're holding official dead figures like a security blanket, unaware of the $200 trillion inferno behind the screen. The exits are still open. You can still hold physical assets, gold and silver, that have no counterparty risk. You can still hold self-custody Bitcoin, which exists outside the banking ladder. It had promised to redeem paper dollars for gold, but it had printed too many dollars and didn't have enough gold. The honest solution would have been to devalue the dollar or stop the redemption. President Roosevelt chose the predatory solution. He issued Executive Order 6102. He declared that hoarding of gold was prolonging the depression. He made it federal crime punishable by 10 years in prison for any American citizen to own more than $100 worth of gold coins or bullion. He ordered every citizen to turn their gold into the Federal Reserve. The government paid them the official rate, $2.67 per ounce. Americans, trusting their governments or fearing the jail time, lined up to hand over their generational wealth. Once the gold was secured in the government vaults, Roosevelt devalued the dollar. He raised the official price of gold to $35 per ounce. Overnight, he had stolen roughly 40% of the wealth of the American people. He took their hot assets, gave them paper, and then torpedoed the value of the paper. The Supreme Court later upheld this confiscation, ruling that the government's power to regulate currency superseded the individual's right to property. This event destroys the idea that it can't happen here. It did happen here, and the legal framework to lied. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 is still on the books. It was the statutory basis for freezing Russian assets in 2022. It can be used to freeze domestic assets in a national emergency. The only difference today is that they don't need to send agents to search your house for gold coins. Because your wealth is digital, they can seize it with a keystroke. They can freeze your brokerage account, seize your 401k, and convert it into government retirement bonds, a proposal that surfaces periodically in Washington, or lock your bank account. The Great Reset is essentially a modern jubilee, but one where the paying is strangely from the borrower to the saver. The $200 trillion debt cannot be paid. It must be liquidated. It will be liquidated through a combination of high inflation, which eats your purchasing power, financial repression, which prevents you from earning a return, and potentially direct confiscation, bail-ins, or wealth taxes. The government has a plan to survive this collapse. They will have the printing press, the CBDC, and the police power of the state. The question is, do you have a plan? The average citizen is sitting in a theater that is on fire watching the movie, oblivious to the smoke. They're holding official debt figures like a security blanket, unaware of the $200 trillion inferno behind the screen. The exits are strewn open. You can still hold physical assets, gold and silver, and they have no counterparty risk. You can still hold self-custody Bitcoin, which exists onside the banking lattice. You can still own productive land or a business, but the window is closing. As the crisis accelerates, the capital controls will tighten. The digital Berlin Wall will go up. When the moment comes, there will be two types of people: those who hold the government's paper promises and those who hold the assets that the government wants to confiscate. The $200 trillion lie is collapsing. The truce is coming. And the truth is that in a bankrupt empire, you are either a creditor who gets defaulted on or an owner who survives. Instead, governments invariably choose option B, the dishonest default. They don't cut the number of dollars they pay you, they simply destroy the value of those dollars before they hand them over. They pay you exactly what they promised, with the money won't buy what it used to. This is not an accident. It is a calculated policy known to Kives as financial repression. It is the art of liquidating debt by slowly stealing the purchasing power of the citizenry. The primary mechanism of financial repression is negative real interest rates. In a healthy economy, if inflation is 3%, your savings account should pay 4% or 5%. It should make a real return. But when the guide needs to melt away its debt, it uses the Federal Reserve to pin interest rates below the rate of inflation. If inflation is 5% and your bank pays you 1%, you're losing 4% of your wealth every single year. You are effectively paying a wealth tax, and just for holding cash. This transfers purchasing power from savers, you, to debtors, the government. It is a silent heist. Over a decade, a 4% negative real rate wipes out 34% of the value of your debt. It is how the United States paid off its massive World War II debt without ever officially defaulting. They just inflated it away. But to make this scheme work, the government needs to do something else. They need to lie about the inflation rate. If the public realized that inflation was truly 8% to 10%, they would demand higher wages and higher interest rates, breaking the refreshment schedule. The government needs the official number to be low, if the reality is high. This brings us to the Consumer Price Index, CPI, the most manipulated statistic in economic history. Up until the early 1980s, the CPI was a fairly honest metric. It measured the cost of the fixed basket of goods. If the price of steak went up, the CPI went up. It was a cost of goods index. But in the 1990s, politicians realized that a high CPI was expensive. Social Security payments are indexed to inflation. If inflation is high, the government has to pay seniors more. So they convened the Boston Commission in 1996. The goal was to modernize the CPI. The result was a shift from a cost of goods index to a cost of living index. This subtle change introduced three statistical tricks that allow the government to report no inflation even when prices are skyrocketing. The first trick is substitution. The old CPI assumed you bought the same things every year. The new CPI assumes that you are a rational economic actor who will switch to cheaper alternatives when prices rise. If the price of steak jumps 50%, the government assumes you will switch to hamburger. If the price of hamburger jumps, they assume you will switch to chicken. Because you switch to the cheaper item, the CPI algorithm calculates that your cost of living didn't actually go up. The cost of steak could double, but if you stop eating steak, the inflation is recorded as zero. This logic ignores the fact that your standard of living has collapsed. You are eating dog food instead of ribeye, but the spreadsheet says you are fine. The second trick is hedonic quality adjustments. This allows the government to lower the price of a good if the quality improves. Let's say a new iPhone costs $1,000 just like the Orwing. In the real world, you pay $1,000, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, argues that the new phone has a better camera and a faster chip. They might calculate that the new phone is twice as good as the old one. Therefore, in the CPI calculation, the price has effectively fallen by 50% to $500, even though $1,000 left your bank account. They apply this to cars, computers, and appliances. It creates a phantom deflation. The official data shows falling prices for electronics, which offsets the rising prices of food and rent, but you can't eat pizzles. The food trick is owner's equivalent rent, OER. Housing is the biggest expense for most Americans, but the CPI does not measure house prices. It doesn't even measure mortgage payments. Instead, the BLS calls homeowners and asks them a hypothetical question. If you were to rent out your house today, how much do you think you could get for it? This is a survey of a guess. It is a soft number that rarely keeps pace with the brutal reality of the actual housing market. While house prices might be up 20% in a year, OER might only show a 4% increase, artificially suppressing the headline inflation number. If you calculate inflation using the methodology from 1980, before these tricks were introduced, the current inflation rate would consistently be double the official number. This means that when the government tells you inflation is 3%, it is likely closer to 6% or 7% in terms of your actual out-of-pocket reality. The gap between the official CPI and the real inflation is the profit margin of the state. It allows them to pay Social Security recipients less than they need to survive. It allows them to report real GDP growth that is actually negative. If you subtract 3% inflation from 2% growth, the economy grew. If you subtract 7% inflation, the economy shrink. But the most insidious effect of this silent default is fiscal drag, bracket creep. As inflation pushes your nominal wage up, you move into higher tax brackets. You aren't actually richer. Your higher salary buys the same amount of bread, but the IRS treats you like a rich person. You lose a higher percentage of your income to taxes, even though your purchasing power hasn't increased. The government effectively takes a bigger slice of a shrinking pie. This is why the middle class feels like it is running on a treadmill. They are working harder, earning more dollars, but falling further behind. They are the victims of a deliberate policy to liquidate the national debt by liquidating the middle class. The saver who beautifully put money in a 401k, the grandmother relying on a fixed pension, the worker saving for a down payment. These are the people paying the price for the government's insolvency. They are not paying with a check. They are paying with the invisible, corrosive tax of false money. However, even financial depression has a limit. You can only trick the bond market for so long before the investors realize they are the suckers at the table. When the bond vigilantes wake up and demand an interest rate that actually beats inflation, the game ends. The government is then forced to print money not just to hide the debt, but to buy the debt itself. This leads to the fine terminal phase of the currency, hyperinflation. But before the money dies completely, the government usually attempts one final desperate move to trap the wealth within its borders. It stops being a silent default and becomes an open confiscation. The end game of the silent default is not a whipper, it is a seizure. As the government continues to repress interest rates and manipulate inflation data, critical threshold is eventually crossed. The bond market, the vigilantes who control the price of long-term money, stops cooperating. They realize that holding a 10-year Treasury bond yielding 4% while inflation is really 8% is a guaranteed mathematical loss. They stop buying. When the buyers strike, yields spike. This triggers a liquidity crisis that forces the Federal Reserve to print money not just to stimulate the economy, but to keep the government's lights on. This is the moment the currency dies, and this is the moment the government turns from a negligent debtor into a predatory enemy.